So we find that a really, really powerful tool, and it helps come up with crazy ideas and challenge assumptions we may have about the users that are really inaccurate. It's really more thinking about like the humans you work with instead of like the humans you're designing for. I just like had this moment of like, am I gonna be like the cloud person that all I'm doing is like drawing clouds for different moods? And what is that gonna mean for my life? Am I gonna get really pretentious about clouds? Pen, because don't bother erasing. If you're erasing, you've messed up. You're on.
Okay, so welcome to the Productized podcast, where we explore the minds of the most innovative entrepreneurs and leaders in product management and design. And for our listeners, this is also an opportunity to learn more about product topics. We are expanding through the Productized conference, and the Productized conference this year has over 25 speakers and trainings that are going to happen here in Lisbon. It's October 2nd to October 4th. The last few tickets, and I mean the last few tickets, are still available at www.productized.co, and we hope to meet you there. When I say we, it's me and my guest. And my guest today is Ashley Nicodemus. She's the Director of Design at UEGroup, a Silicon Valley consultancy and user research and product design firm. Ashley specializes in designing seamless experiences for medical devices, wearables, implants, and critical environments for companies like Disney, Lockheed Martin, Stryker Corporation, Boston Scientific. She's also super passionate about mentoring design students. She's doing that at Purdue University, and she's been involved in several professional training programs. One of the things they do is workshop trainings, and that's exactly what Ashley is going to be doing here at Productized this year. She's going to lead a workshop at Productized Conference 2024 titled The Innovation Equation, a Blueprint for Disruptive Products. And she'll teach us how to redefine product experiences using UEGroup's Innovation Equation framework. That's a trademarked framework that they have developed. It's a tool for creating innovative solutions within your constraints, whatever they are. And Ashley, welcome to the Productized podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Amazing. We're super excited. This is one of the topics that we are also super. I mean, when I say one of the topics, I mean critical environments. And, we were talking before the podcast about the last time that you guys did a workshop with us. It was online. It was still pretty under COVID duress times. And at the time, 2021, you already gave a workshop on developing for critical environments. And I guess you have evolved this methodology, this framework. We're going to deep dive into that. But before we do that, let me ask you just a couple of questions. What's your favorite app right now on your phone?
On my phone. So
Yeah.
I do not use a ton of applications. Really, I'm one of
Mm.
those people that tries to minimize my phone time as much as possible. So, I think it's all about, stripping back as much as you can. So all of my phone time is really functional and boring. Lots of emails and unfortunately Figma in there too. But I actually do more just like calling and chatting. So even though I'm a little bit younger, I function like an old lady on my phone.
Hmm.
Don't really do much in the way on.
You could go back to one of those dumb phones. Maybe
Yeah,
a BlackBerry would do for you, right?
totally. Yeah. Just trying to, live that minimal.
So I guess email. Do you use vanilla email reader, or do you have like a special email
I just
reader like
use Outlook.
superhuman?
I don't use
You use Outlook?
Yeah, I just use Outlook and Teams and all of that. Nothing major. I'm even using a really old phone. I've got still the iPhone with a button on it. So
Yeah, yeah.
those
Are you happy? Are you happy with Outlook?
well, I mean, it's fine. It's enough.
It's email at the end of the
Yeah,
day
it's
with all
email.
the constraints of email. Yeah, I
Nothing's really.
was, I've always been an Outlook guy for many years. I had like I was doing my corporate job, so I had Windows and Outlook and all that. So yesterday I was on a plane and it was this gentleman in front of me. So I couldn't pretend not to look because the guy was literally seated in front of me. So, sometimes I would just check his email because that's all he was doing. He was using Outlook on Mac. And I was like, oh man, I'm becoming a little bit nostalgic. Maybe I should check Outlook again. Um, What's your favorite way to relax after a busy day? And here, the keyword I think is after. It cannot be like, oh yeah, before I go to the gym. No, no,
No,
after.
no, no.
After the days, the work day is done. What do you do
Yeah.
if you want to relax?
So, I mean, I think during the workday, there's just so much screen time. It's like eyes are burnt out. So I really like to take my dog out on a walk around the neighborhood. Just get away, get outside. Living in California, the weather's pretty much always nice, so it's great to just kind of walk around, and my dog enjoys it too. So can't complain there.
All right. Specifically in San Jose, where
Yes,
you're based, right?
yeah,
All
Silicon Valley,
right. Yeah, going for a walk is always therapeutic in many ways.
absolutely.
That's so true. All right, so design. Let's get it to it. What's your? I mean, you have like impressive background. I know you've been with the UE group for a while. I'd love to, take a step back to the very beginning of your design journey. What's the first design project you've ever worked on, and how did it influence your approach today? Or, I mean, maybe it's something you did where you were very young or not. So how did you get into design in the first place?
Yeah, so my first professional design project was actually in industrial design. So I studied industrial
Hmm.
design in school. So while I was still in college, I was able to do some work for this company called Extra Cycle. They're a cargo bike company. So my work with that was industrial design focused. I created a awning, like a pop up awning for their child seat attachment, that was like on the back of the bike. So I made the child seat and then the box art, which was really fun. I got to like illustrate the cityscape, which was really, you know, pretty and just like a fun thing to do. And then I actually made all the user manual and support content for it. So I think the really big thing that like I took away from that process, um, because really that work feels so much different than the work I do now. Because it was very, drawing oriented, very like artistic.
Hmm.
But the main thing that changed for me through that was I realized how little of a fraction the actual product design part is of the whole product experience and the package that you're selling, right? Um, you have to think about the moment somebody interacts with the brand for the first time, the product for the first time, and then how they set it up, how it evolves over time, how they use it, and creating that user manual and all of the different things that they may need to consider really opened my eyes to that and made me want to start there instead of starting with the little awning and how it worked mechanically. I wanted to think about designing that whole process and what that experience was really like. So that's really what changed my focus from just, the industrial design, which is really exciting and fun to work in, to experience design overall and how we can create things that are really holistic. I think is more interesting. There's just so much more meat to dive into there and how you could really make sure that a product is going to fit somebody's life, and that they're going to be able to successfully use it, because even if it's the most intuitive pop-up shade, they need to have all the other support material to be able to use it correctly, so and get exposed to it in the first place. So that was really the start of everything,
That
and where
was
things
like
shifted.
your first professional project, right? But like you
Yeah.
said, you went to industrial design. And I
Mhm.
guess most kids not saying, "Hey, mom, what do you want to?" Oh, I want to be an industrial designer, right? It's not, usually it's not happening a lot. Like they want to do, I don't know, astronaut, police.
Yeah.
I mean, were you into? designing stuff when you were a kid, or is this like a late discovery, like late teens? You said, "Oh, maybe industrial design is something I want to do."
Yeah, so I started out in fine arts. I absolutely
Hmm.
love drawing and painting and all of that. In high school, I won a couple awards for my work. And so I was really into that side of things. And my parents, as sweet and supportive as they are, they were like, fine arts is not a career. What would you like to do? And luckily in Silicon Valley here, there's a lot of opportunity. So I started doing research into different types of work. And with that, I started looking into like what animation and illustration might look like because I loved to draw and do art. Um,
Hmm.
but then I found out that they really focus you in on one particular aspect. Like you don't get to, as the animator or illustrator, create the whole scene, the characters. You don't get to do it all. What ends up happening is you specialize in one element. So I just like had this moment of like, am I going to be like the cloud person that all I'm doing is like drawing clouds for different moods? And what is that going to mean for my life? Am I going to get really pretentious about clouds? Like, what's going to happen here? And I just, so that made me start looking into other things. And that's when I found industrial design. And I was actually able to tour Frog Studios back in the day. They
Oh,
were really
oh,
relevant,
wow.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's really when I fell in love with it. And this was all in high
But
school.
sorry, did you visit Frog Studios? Was it?
Yeah.
Oh, you went like on a study field trip.
No, so I was able through like connections, able to reach out to people, and we were able
Hmm.
to organize a tour with
A
one of the
tour.
people that worked there.
And that's how you got your eye into, wow, this is industrial design. I want to do this.
Yeah, so that's what sold me on it. I was
Hmm.
interested, found it through individual research, and then did that tour. Was able to organize a tour with an individual that worked there, and they took me around
Wow.
and showed me the process, and the wall of sketches, and all of that cool stuff. So at that point, I fell in love with it, and luckily, San Jose State the is a big school like right nearby. Right, it's where I've grown up and all of that.
Hmm.
So I was able to go to college there for it, and they're renowned for that program. So it kind of was, um, you know, something that I directly was seeking it out as an option of a way to apply artistic skills or my artistic passions to something more practical, which was an exciting idea. The San Jose State program is really competitive. So it had a starting class of 50 for the entire year. And by the time I graduated with 12 people. So really
Wow.
competitive.
That's, are you sure you didn't go to the SEALs or something like that? Um, wow. Yeah. And why is that? Is just because people keep giving up, and or is it because it's so intense and you have such a crazy workload of stuff that people just say, forget about it. I just cannot make it.
Yeah. So pretty much all of the reasons you mentioned. So
Mm.
the way it works in that program, or at least it did back in the day when I went there, you have these like studio classes, and so you have to, every studio class is a project that you make, or multiple projects you make, and at the end of the year there's a portfolio review. And even if you do well in all your classes, you get straight A's. The portfolio
Mm.
review is done by all of the professors, and if you
Oh,
don't
wow.
pass the portfolio review, you have to retake classes.
Wow.
So you basically have to redo that year. And they're pretty harsh in that portfolio review. So that can really deter people that like aren't ready for the negative feedback, that can't handle the thought of like having to redo things. So it's just cutthroat. But I'm really appreciative that we went through that, because the real world, you know, doesn't sugarcoat things
Yeah,
either. So,
that's true. Yeah, yeah. Start dealing with negative feedback, but the harsh thing is you have to take those classes if you don't do the cut. Eventually, you got into UE Group, and
mhm.
if been playing a pivotal role in shaping the firm and how the design strategy and philosophy is there. Can you share with us your approach to design and how it has evolved in leading a team that's pushing the boundaries in such a high stakes industry? Has, we're talking Lockheed Martin, right? Those are critical life and death decisions that you're taking.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think, like most people, it started with design thinking, and because that's what I was taught in college, and that's I think how a lot of people start out with design, with ideas, pushing those philosophies and everything. So that's where I started, and really with the spirit of trial and error. But when you hit those high stakes industries, there's things out there that just don't fit in the design thinking model. So a lot of
Hmm.
times, with design thinking, you're supposed to start with something that exists, figure out the pain points, the workarounds, and then come up with new ways of doing that. The problem is that sometimes people come to you in high stakes industries with ideas or things that they want to do that don't have models out in the world yet.
Right.
So
They are, brand new. They're never been done before.
exactly. So my first project that I had in the high stakes industry, it was for a cybersecurity team, and their mission was to visualize a threat moving through an organization. And
Hmm.
at the time, and even still today, a lot of cybersecurity platforms, it's pie charts, maybe a bar graph. Uh,
Right.
how do you visualize a threat moving through a system? And that
Right.
was one of those moments where it really rocked that foundation of, well, what do I do now? Because these
Hmm.
templates put out in the world for me.
Yeah, you have to watch lots of Hollywood movies because they're always doing this crazy. I don't know. Everything is very, it's like a swarm is coming in. And how did you do that?
So I had to start breaking it down into what does a person actually need in that situation? What information are they trying to find out, and at what levels? What do they need to understand at a high level to direct their attention versus
Hmm.
when do they need to change that way that they're looking and get into the details and nitty gritty? Um, with the way that things were given to us, it was basically a table of data.
Hmm.
So how do you transition that table of data into the different levels of granularity you need when you're trying to identify a problem? So we were able to make a couple different visualizations through this, but it really had to start from that process of what are they trying to find out in each of these scenarios, and based off of that, how many different visualizations do we need to tell them these different things? So it really started at user decisions instead of like, what kind of decisions are they making? How are they thinking? Instead of, okay, this is what exists now. How do we update it? And
Hmm.
that was definitely a difficult process, something that I had to figure out as I went, but changed the way I think about design and how it goes. So we ended up doing this like timeline visualization that started at one piece, and then you can kind of like see how things like explode and get wider as you go through, and then you can zoom into the endpoints. We also created this really interesting almost like a heat map, but like a relationship map that you could play like a movie. So you could see how things interact, would come in and out over time, and how like a threat could grow in size, or shrink based off of activity and the things that they would touch. So you could kind of like play a movie. That's a visualization. We did a lot of weird
Hmm.
things with that one, but
But what's the design because to have that kind of creative and imagination, because you're really playing it out. I guess you guys meet in a room and you have this tabula rasa perspective of things, right? You have this blank piece of paper, say, okay, guys, this has never been done before. So of course you have all these moods. You might inspire yourselves and this and that, but how do you go through the process? You start coming up with ideas. You have like any specific thing? And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because of course that's also part of the workshop thing, but just out of curiosity, it's about the human interaction that I'm interested about. When you talk to your colleagues, Is this a brainstorm situation, or is this more of a reflective, and then you come up with your own ideas and you discuss which one seems to work best?
Yeah, so we typically don't do like brainstorms where we're all sitting together and writing things on post-its. What we normally do is more of those meetings to all get together and agree on like the constraints and like what the goals are. So they're more like synthesis meetings where we've all
Hmm.
done research, we've all read about things, we've all done observations, done interviews, whatever. We've all collected information somehow, and then we come together and talk about the meaning of it, and everyone has their own take. And then from there, we decide what the next steps are. And then typically, it's a bit more of a individual thinking through it process when you're actually trying to come up with the solutions. Because yeah, great, you can riff off each other in a brainstorm, but to really think through what those things mean or like work through like a half idea. You get something
Hmm.
like, ooh, that's kind of interesting, but like, how would that work? It takes a little bit more thought than just, sitting around a table and throwing things out. But
Hmm.
then what we do is we come back together after whatever time we've allotted for that brainstorm, that individual off brainstorm. And then we come together, we share ideas, and talk about, give people more ideas that might, come up based off of what they're sharing.
Right.
And then,
Let me just interrupt you for a second, to ask you a lot about that individual brainstorm that you're talking about.
mhm.
What does it look like? Do you have any setting, any state of mind, any hour of the day, any I don't know, any room? Is that a room? I don't know. Some people come up with different, I don't know, in mental landscapes to come to these states of creativity. What works for you?
For me, I like to sit in front of my big monitor. I have the material up of like my quick list of like what are the goals and the problems I'm trying to solve. I like to have that in front of me, have the ability to bring up research that I might want to reference. And then I am sitting with a gigantic stack of paper and I'm drawing.
Hmm.
I find it,
Pen and paper.
yes, pen and paper.
Okay.
Um, pen, because don't bother erasing. If you're erasing, you've messed up. You're already like,
Why is that?
so you're putting too much thought into one thing. Let the
Oh,
idea
okay.
come out. Let it be what it's going to be and then move on. If you're sitting there
Hmm.
fussing erasing, you're spending too much time on something that, let that be what it was and now do the next one. That's
Right.
it's maybe a silly thing, but I find it's helpful. So yeah, you just sitting there with a pen and paper and coming up with ideas and making little notes. I find the physical aspect really helps just because like, I don't know, brains think differently with paper than they do digitally.
Hmm.
It like sinks in better. It helps turn the wheels a little bit.
And then you digitize those sketches, I guess, into
We
whatever,
just
or
take
you
one or do
you just
like
take pictures.
yeah.
Okay, right.
We're
And then
doing
that's what. And
scans, where it like whatever, slightly better quality than just a picture of a sketch.
gotcha. All right, and you take it from there. So I have interrupted to the point that you were explaining. After you've done this individual brainstorm, which you just explained how, what happens next?
So we all come together with our paper sketches or pictures of our paper sketches. Uh,
When you say you would come together physically, or you guys work in a remote setting?
we have people in office, but we also have people remote. And even
Hmm.
our in office workers are hybrid. So I'm at home right
Hmm.
now, but I work in the office sometimes. So we always have a call happening too, because some of our designers are in different areas.
Hmm.
So everyone's sharing their different sketches. And then what we do is write on post-it notes when people are sharing their sketches, common themes that are happening across multiple sketches. And that just helps us figure out how we want to organize, and combine ideas. Um, and I'll kind of leave it there because I don't want to steal the thunder of later. But the way that we combine ideas, I think, is where some of the secret sauce lies, um,
Hmm.
to being able to come up with untraditional solutions.
And who's the boss? Who says, "Oh, this idea goes through. This idea maybe is not going through." Is this like something you decide and has a consensus? You have a votes, or you know?
So whoever the lead designer is ultimately makes the final call. But
Hmm.
it is a conversation of trade-offs and strategy, right? Where it's worth chasing down multiple ideas usually at that phase, to see where it leads and to see what really is going to make the most sense for the final outcome. We like to get reactions to what we call polarizing concepts, with this like intention of almost in a way like engineering failure into our process to learn
Hmm.
from that. Um, if you come to a user with something that's a middle of the road solution,
Yeah.
the user they want to give you good feedback. They want to make you happy. And that's why rating scales are usually always like inflated a little bit. People want to give that 4 satisfied, even if they're more like a 3 or a 2. So what we like to do instead is give people multiple things to look at, and make them crazy, because it's easier for somebody to start really talking about things differently, giving you new ideas if they're seeing something that they didn't expect. You're gonna get a
Hmm.
reaction out of them that way. And when you show them multiple things that are wildly different, then they can start to talk about, and we like to do it based off of trade offs, which is really something baked into our process that we'll talk about later. Um, we like to talk about the trade offs. So we'll choose concepts that are pulling on the ends of that trade off.
Hmm.
So that way, when we're talking to participants, talking to users, they can talk us through why they lean towards one or the other in different parts of that interface or experience or whatever.
Hmm.
So then we can understand their logic on how they would deal with that trade off, and then create an actual solution that's much more realistic and middle ground. But we're putting time and energy into things we know we're going to throw away, but it's a research tool. It really helps us understand, what is that right direction, and not based off of our own assumption, based off of how a bunch of people react to something that they'd actually have to use. So we find that a really, really powerful tool, and it helps come up with crazy ideas and challenge assumptions we may have about the users that are really inaccurate.
And how do you balance the user needs with business objectives when prioritizing features or design elements? And I guess sometimes this is something which you could say, well, that's maybe out of scope of what we should be doing as designers, but is it?
No, I think it's directly our role to
Hmm.
help with that. I think, as designers, we are kind of the center point in a way of these different, forces coming together. So business objectives is a huge part of that. And if you ignore it, basically your product won't get made the way that you created it. So the idea is really, well, the way that we like to deal with this is, always talking through trade-offs. I mean, that's a big center of the way that we do things, from like our own discussions also to the way that we are trying to get things out of participants. So if you can be able to present to a team, the in our case, our clients, okay, we think this is a good solution to this problem because of this, but it's going to have this drawback. So if you want to, we can shift it this way. Um,
Hmm.
and then it becomes a conversation that's not, it can kind of disarm some more like political viewpoints and like corporate politics kind of viewpoints of like people pushing their own agendas, because then it's not about my design or my feature or your feature. It's about one decision that needs to be made. How is this going to work? How do you feel about this trade off? And the way that we create our design ideas, we've like normalized that. So that way, when there is a trade off being made, we have other ideas that maybe not be as developed, but we have other ideas ready to go to swap in and out. So it makes it really easy to adapt to whatever the changing needs are. And that there isn't like this one size fits all solution or one way it like this is the right design. It's going to change, and that's okay. There's a lot of different ways that it can be done, and we're here to support whatever that is. Let's just do it with a strong reason and foundation and make sure it's backed up with some information.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can swap things in and out to make that happen. So we're all about that.
All right. I mean, you guys have an impressive portfolio on your website, which it's uegroup.com. And one of the projects I find, I mean, all of them are, I would say, mind blowing, but one which is literally mind blowing, is um, the brain surgery from Stryker, which
That's
you
my
have here.
favorite.
That's your favorite?
Yeah.
Which I guess it's really a little bit crazy in many ways. So this is, can you explain us what this is?
Absolutely. So, yeah, like I said, that was my favorite project I've ever worked on. It was really exciting times because when they reached out to us to work on that project, it was actually all of their navigation platform. So it's used, yes, for Cranial Map, which is their brain surgery platform, but it's also used for spine as well. And so we had to redefine their entire surgical navigation platform and create a design system that was in a framework that was going to scale to
So
everything.
this is just for lay people like obviously me. This is the kind of navigational tool that doctors and surgeons would use to do what? To understand how,
Yeah.
you know,
So
the X-ray shows up, the REM. So, what kind of information is the doctor looking at this uh, platform?
absolutely. Yeah. So the way that surgical navigation works, it's mapping the physical space to a pre-op image. So
Hmm.
what's happening there is it's allowing more minimally invasive surgeries. So instead of having
Hmm.
to make really big entry points, so they can visually see what's happening underneath the skin,
And entry points implies doing basically a
a
hole
big
in
hole.
the in like literally a hole, right, in the, what's the name, in the skull,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
take that piece of the skull and inspect visually. So
yeah.
instead of doing like this big hole in the skull,
Hmm.
it allows for
Much smaller.
little holes, much
Pinpoint.
smaller, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
Which is something much more reassuring as a patient, I would say. I mean,
yeah,
luckily I've never
and
been involved in those,
the
but
healing times are way, way better, right? Because you don't have to grow back a big chunk of your skull. You don't have big scars
hmm,
that mess up your hairline. Those are things that people are worried about going into this type of thing.
sure.
I mean, many of the worries, but assuming everything goes well, that's one of the things that people are concerned about. So not only does
By the way, did you get to speak with patients as well in such a
oh
design process?
we got to speak
All right.
with everybody really involved in it. So we did work with scrub techs, which are the people that are putting together the all the tools and giving things to the surgeon as they need to. We talked to the surgeons and we did physical tests with the design that we created. And that was really interesting because it went from lower fidelity where people are using things over like a foam head to full blown cadaver labs, which,
Hmm.
oh boy, that was maybe one of the weirdest experiences of my life. We had like rented a suite in a hotel room and they brought the cadavers into this like hotel.
Sorry to be laughing. Maybe I should not, but I was just not expecting this to be done
I
in a
was
hotel room.
there and I wasn't expecting
Hmm.
it. It was crazy because for cadavers it's always usually it's a chunk, to put it not maybe in the best way, but because you get more use out of the donation when you're only focused on the piece. So that way more people can learn from the other pieces, right? So in this
Hmm.
cadaver lab, we legitimately had severed heads that were
Hmm.
in like the clamps that they use in surgery to keep a head steady that were just
Yes.
floating over tables. So it was like,
Yes.
what am I looking at? What am I doing today? Like it was crazy.
Well, you can say you have, let's say, an interesting job, right?
Yeah, yeah.
To
So
say the least.
it was very interesting, but it was, once you get over the visual, it was so informative and we got really great feedback through that process. So, people were able to use it in real time working where they're
Hmm.
dealing with the feedback of so a big part of surgery, the different anatomy has different textures. So they know where they're going based off of the physical feedback that they're getting from the tools as they're entering different types of tissues or bone or whatever. So we were able to, at that testing level of fidelity,
Hmm.
use the feedback of the software, but then also see how they react to the feedback that the tissue is giving them. So we can see when they're looking at the screen, when they're looking at the patient, and how all these things work together. So it was really, really interesting. And we got amazing feedback from it, which is part of why this like felt so great, this process. We got quotes like, "Where has this been all my life?" to another one being,
Oh, wow.
I wouldn't call this idiot proof, but I'll call it surgeon proof. So making something that should be really complex and crazy to so turnkey. So I follow the directions and I'm there that they felt like they couldn't mess it up, which is
Mm.
really great because then instead of thinking about the screen and the process there, they can really focus on that tissue. They can focus on getting exactly like the look of what they've pulled out, all those feedback elements that are patient oriented. They can focus on that and they don't need to worry about the rest of the technology in the room.
Did you ever got feedback at the later stage of the development process, let's say high fidelity, which made you go back to the drawing board and say, well, we've come all the way to here, but well, maybe we have to go back.
So I've never had to start from scratch because ideally you've been testing at lower fidelity going all the way
Yes.
through it, right? So there
Yes.
shouldn't be any major surprises around like the framework or workflow or things like that. But what has happened is, on a smaller detail side of things, like you get to that higher fidelity, and we originally we were doing. So for that particular project, we had there's like this big device that has a bunch of knobs on it, and all the knobs are color coded. So the
Hmm.
system knows what position each of those knobs needs to be in, and it tells you how to do it. So originally, as one of the constraints, we were told you cannot. They need to be able to move any knob at any time, and it
Hmm.
shouldn't be singly guided. So we had it originally going into that testing where once they started to turn a knob, it would tell them how much to turn it.
Hmm.
We learned through that process that people were kind of stuck when they got to it. They're like, okay, I've got this crazy device. I'm looking on the screen. I see the crazy device on the screen, but now what? So we ended up going back to this idea of even that process needed to be guided. So is it a crazy or start from scratch moment? No, but a asset that we had in there or a piece of the workflow needed to be rethought from being completely flexible, do it how you want to actually we need to make this a really guided experience. So there are some things that happen, but you just swap out those elements, and because in the beginning we had already thought about it being, showing you a single knob at a time and having you, getting you to turn it a certain amount and all of these things, we are just able to, okay, we're going to go with that idea now, and we swap them out, and we just need to bring it up to that fidelity that the rest of the design is at. So I think it's more about that idea of having a really modular approach where you can, bring things in and out as you need to, as you um, start to zoom in on what that, or narrow down what that final direction is going to be.
Hmm. Which also implies that from a psychological trait that people in your team have to have is um, intellectual honesty to recognize that, well, maybe my genius idea is not as genius as I thought it was, which I guess if you had like, your university experience, that was fine because you had so much drama there. But yeah, it's so hard for people, and I guess for professionals still, to recognize that maybe, something is wrong. I have to redesign this. How do you deal with this? Is this just something that you're expecting from a good professional, or is this something you have to keep training over and over to, keep your ego under tame, so you make sure that I'm always learning on the job?
So I would say it really starts with the beginning of the project. You need to set expectations in the very beginning of a project of how
Hmm.
this is going to be. And there's things that you could do to, because we work with clients all the time. So sometimes you get clients with a little bit of an ego, and that's okay. Those are people, and you got to work with people the way that they are, and they can bring a lot of value to a project too. So what
Hmm.
we do is coming up with a bunch of ideas is critical in the beginning, right? Because that prevents some of that like attachment to an individual idea. If you have a bunch of ideas that you think are good and cool, then all of a sudden, it's not about just the one that you really are attached to. There's, oh, that's a good idea over there. That's a good idea over there. So depending on how we bring things in and out, people still have that affinity towards a design, feeling like they contributed to it. So it's
Hmm.
definitely important to force coming up with a lot of ideas in the beginning and not going to just one, thinking this is the solution, to prevent that way of thinking. But then also, it's really critical to, in the beginning of a project, to talk to all of the stakeholders involved, and almost treat that as like a little mini user test or user interview, where we really try and understand everybody's view of the goals and the problems and the pain points within the space we're about to go into. And this is really important because it allows us to later speak their language. So if we understand their concerns and their goals and the way that they talk about them, later in those trade-off conversations, we can specifically quote what they said and
Hmm.
the things they're concerned about in the words they use. And this makes somebody feel like they've directly influenced whatever you're currently working on, and that you're thinking about what they said and that they're part of that process. So then, even if it's not an idea they came up with, it's addressing a thing that they brought up. So they still feel that ownership. So it's a really important part of the process, and it's really more thinking about like the humans you work with instead of like the humans you're designing for. But it's
Hmm.
really important, and it gets people all feeling connected to the team, to the work, and make sure everything goes smoother. So I really encourage it.
So, talking about teams and collaborations, how do you manage this conflicts of defining priorities between design and product teams, and especially when it comes to feature prioritization? And do you approach this differently? Do you have like I don't know, internal philosophy on who's always right at the end of the day has to be X or Y?
Yeah, so there are definitely some things that trump, perspectives, like individual perspectives or tastes, don't matter when it comes to safety being in question, right?
Mm.
So there's things that are always going to be first. So safety, usability, those have to come first, because if people are going to make mistakes, any kind of error prevention, you know okay, a user is annoyed because they have to do another click, but that click is going to potentially save somebody. Okay, doesn't
Hmm.
matter, you're doing that click. There's things like that, and luckily people that work in these spaces, they understand that and they want that. So people that are users using these types of tools in those environments, they understand that those safety nets need to be there.
Right.
When we get past that, and then it's about, in a way, the flavor in which a design is driven. So we have the safety net, we have it's going to be safe and effective. That's always a medical thing. Now it's a matter of like, how does it feel when you're interacting with it? What kind of tone does it have? Those types of things can be, people may want different things when they're working with it, or different information prioritized, or things like that. And what we like to do is pinpoint those moments of tensions, and really focus on them, because usually that's where there's real opportunity. Those are areas people have avoided because there isn't a clear answer, right? So if you focus on those areas, there can be really interesting opportunities to make something unique and to hit an untapped market. That could be your differentiator in your product. So we like to focus on those first and figure out really what that should be. And from there, by exploring that gradient between those polarized ideas, you can come up with really unique and interesting solutions. But you have to understand why somebody has that perspective. Because if you just take people's feedback at face value,
Mm-hmm.
that's not real. Like, then people are going to want different things. And it's like, well, what do I do? They want different things. But if
Right.
you understand why and the root of that why, usually there's some common ground in there. That's where the interesting places to play. So that's the way that we like to interact with it. And then bring it back to those people that had those particular opinions and see, okay, now how do they react and what does this mean for their lives? So that's kind of how we like to approach it.
And I think that's also, a good segue to my next question, which is, at Productized conference, you'll be facilitating a workshop,
Mm-hmm.
which is called the Innovation Equation, which is a little bit mysterious, like all equations. But for equations are not necessarily mysterious, right? But for product managers, balancing innovation with constraints, like I said, is a constant challenge. It's just part of the
Absolutely.
job. How does this innovation equation that you have come up with at UEGroup help teams innovate effectively within these limits? What are we going to learn here?
Yeah. So, the innovation equation is basically built out of all of those things that we've been talking about, going through the innovation process ourselves in these high stakes environment and being like, oh, I'm unprepared. There's nothing out there to help me get through this problem. And through
Hmm.
that, I've kind of figured out what works for me. And then when we brought in new team members and I started to have to train people, or I'm working with clients and I have to kind of fill them in on our process, that started really formalizing it in a way that's like teachable. That's like, this is actually what we're looking at, instead of just going off of my own thinking, right? So we've brought it into basically taking processes that exist today of design thinking, lean UX, sprint cycles, human centered design, and broken it down to a little bit more detail. So, what do you really need to know to be able to innovate? So, we call those innovation building blocks. What do you really need to know? And then from
Hmm.
there, plugging it into an equation. There's actually an equation in there.
Oh my God. I think half of the people are giving up on a workshop right now. Hearing the podcast. Oh, I was thinking going to this workshop. I don't know about this equation part.
No,
What do you mean about an equation? Is it like a very simple equation?
it's simple. There's no math involved. There's no math.
No math. Okay.
No
It's just a
math.
metaphor.
Yes, it's a metaphorical equation.
Okay.
So what happens is you take those building blocks, and the importance of the building blocks is that it's normalized. So any insight that you bring in, they're all coming in the same format, right? So then you can put in those together into the equation. And that's combining a business goal and a problem we're trying to solve with a behavior of a user, their emotion, how they're feeling that's affecting that behavior. And then with that, we're going to bring in a familiarity that they have to come up with a solution. So, familiarity in a technology that's going to solve that problem for that person. So, with that, we come up with all these things called micro designs. And I know I'm throwing a lot of terms out there that aren't common terms, but in the workshop, we're going to go into this stuff in more detail, make more sense of it. But the idea is that we come up with a bunch of ideas really quickly to solve very specific problems.
So micro designs are akin to sketches or something like that.
Yeah. So it doesn't have to be a sketch. It could be written out, just like written out an idea.
Right.
So a micro design is an idea, but it's specific to one problem for one perspective.
Right.
So what we do is we go through each problem and we solve it for every perspective. So then what we end
And
up
the
having,
perspective is the perspective of different users, or
yeah, it's a
right,
user behavior and emotion.
right, okay.
And so what we do is through that combination, we now have a bunch of ideas. And it's a lot easier to come up with a bunch of ideas when you're not trying to solve it for everybody. That can be really crippling when you're there being like, okay, well, this could be cool for this person, but this person's going to hate it. So it just frees you up from all of that. You can come up with a bunch of ideas that are more unique. And then when we share the ideas after that process, we can see how everybody solved these problems differently. And then we can combine we create concepts from that. And let me know if I'm losing you. But we create these concepts where we're combining every concept has a solution to each problem. And then you combine them based off of the different perspectives that make sense together. So that's how we create these polarizing concepts, because we look at two viewpoints that we know are contradictory, and we create two concepts that are going to be all the way on that contradiction by pulling in those micro designs that really lean that way. And then we get people's reactions to that and talk through the trade-offs of those really opposite end viewpoints. And through that, then we can create what we call desirability factors, where we can say, okay, these different types of people, they care about these things at these different points. And based off of that, now we have a defined direction that we know is going to work for these different people. And we're going to prioritize different viewpoints at different times based off of how important they are to the business goal and the type of task that's happening. So for example, the cranial map project, that brain surgery project, in the setup parts of that process, that's all about the scrub tech and the circulating nurses, the people setting up the room. So their viewpoint is made the priority in that part of the interface. Once you hit go and it's surgery time, those people are put on the back seat, even though they're still very involved. But the surgeon is now running the show, and their viewpoint needs to be the one that matters. So by having ideas created, even for the scrub tech during the surgery flow, we know what they're going to want during that time, and maybe we can sneak it in a little bit, but it's not the primary thing, right? It allows us to have more strategic control because we've created ideas for everybody. And they're at really low fidelity. It's just a little on a piece of paper, just a little note, a little idea jotted down, but it gives you somewhere to start.
So what is the equation about is the combination, and how you do this combination of polarizing factors.
Yeah, so the
Is that
equation itself is the combination of an individual problem and perspective.
right?
So it's just taking those building blocks, the innovation building
So at
blocks.
the end, you have a matrix, right?
Yes,
Because you have different
exactly.
perspectives, and okay, got it, got
That's
it.
the concept matrix that you're creating at that.
Oh, concept matrix. There, we have another term.
Yeah,
All right, so you have design factors, have directions, concept matrix, micro designs. Man, get ready. um,
built off of, like, we have names for all of the templates. Basically, it's a name for a template, but it's all built off of foundations that people use now, right? It's just this slightly different way of looking at it. So these terms may sound intimidating when there is no visual to look at, but it'll all make a lot more sense once we're No,
Absolutely. You have a canvas and you have a template. So, how can product managers apply these principles in their day to day work to drive more impactful product outcomes? Because at the end of the day, that's what you're looking for. You want to have impactful product outcomes, and we've discussed why business is important, but why user desirability is also important. So let's just use the outcome mantra to describe this. But I think the question is really, we have lots of product managers coming to the event,
Mhm.
and I was actually speaking in another podcast with another guest that we're going to have this year. She's from Switzerland, Tanya Lau, and she was talking about how how she's learning so much from people that are not necessarily in the product space, and that's one of the reasons that I think it's also so important to bring people from the design space, um, because at the end of the day, you know, we're all designing the same. We're designing products
Absolutely.
for people and users. So, um, trying to evangelize here the product community. How do you think this sound principles, design principles? Because at the end of the day, like you said, this is about UX, it's about sprinting, human centered design. Apply to their day to day work, or how could they actually apply them?
Yeah. So all of this can absolutely be done by a product manager, but I understand that they might not want to. But the reality is that product managers nowadays are having to do more and more stuff that used to be done by designers. So it's good to be aware of the way that design has been approached, to be able to better give direction to whoever is actually designing the product. But this level of work is all at the idea phase. So product managers have to create ideas all the time, so they could do this process themselves. But if you don't want to go through this process, there are still some gems that you could take that are going to make your product management life a lot easier. So some things that are big into that. First, team management, getting everybody's voice in to like understand where they want a product to go and getting their terminology. It's a really small step that is taken at the beginning. Or you could do it really at any, if you're kicking off any new activity, but that step really helps get your team on board and helps normalize the conversation of trade-offs. Because ultimately, if we're talking about a design in the context of trade-offs, it gets rid of those political motivators or emotional motivators people might have for choosing a product or choosing a product direction, the team. So it really helps
Hmm.
anchor that conversation in business strategy. So I highly recommend taking that step so that way you can manage your team a little easier. Some other things, never jump to your best guess solution. That is going to lead to a end product that is based off of the way you think or the way the designer thinks, and not especially the way that the end user thinks. So if you let them define what that direction should be, you're way likelier to get something that aligns with their life and fits the target market or whatever better, right?
Where does that leave some space for the designer's own charisma to be there in the product?
Yeah, so there's a lot of room for that because what this is doing is defining a direction and a tone. And that is like the light or inspiration that a designer can take and turn it into something. It actually is more freedom than just giving somebody a feature list or a user story, because those are usually already like there's usually already a way something's been done. Like if I were to tell you we need a file sharing mechanism, you have something in your brain about what file sharing is. But if you were instead to say, I want a really fun and friendly way to share content with a loved one.
Hmm.
That has more interest in, oh, what's that going to be? So it gets you more open and more of a spark of new different ideas than the way that these types of things are typically handed down now from product manager, the person writing the requirements, to the designer who's actually making it. So there's tons of room for that kind of freedom.
Yeah, because you were opening the space problem really much larger. It becomes much wider. All
Yeah.
right. So something you're also very passionate about is being active in mentorship, both in design, broader product communities, also at the university level. What's your advice for, you know, students who want to, who are learning? What's your common ground, a kind of advice that you have to resort from, that you see yourself um, coming back to, and how do you see the future of mentorship evolving in this space, especially because we're in a very specific area, right, which is in my perspective, at least at the university level, I think they're very far away from looking into this kind of real world problem, especially with some kind of criticality. So how, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I think students are often, their minds are blown when you're just like, this work is more than application design. It's more than mobile apps and it's more than websites. There's a lot here. So I always encourage students to think about use cases that are not consumer based, just to get them thinking about different types of problems. If you work in a B2B situation, or if you're doing anything that has less traditional user groups, there's more interesting things there. And then I always sell it to them in the sense of it's differentiating your portfolio, because students always want stuff for their portfolio, help with that. How do I get my next job? How do I stand out? Those are the questions. So
Hmm.
I always tell them, think about it from a different use case. Don't go straight to your, if you give me another mobile streaming app, I'm going to be done with it. I'm moving on. So how do you think about it from a different way? And if you are going to do something that is that mobile streaming or mobile shopping experience, don't do the front end that's consumer facing, do the management end. What does it look like for the person who's putting in content to that? Just to get them thinking about it from other types of things,
Hmm.
more complex use cases that they need, or tasks that they need to support. So that's definitely a piece of it. And then I also try and encourage people to be thinking through like the impacts a little bit more of what they're doing. How can you make this efficient for the entire cycle and not just, the person purchasing or whatever like that. So for students, I keep it pretty entry level, of just like, have you thought about it outside of this context that you're learning, which is
Hmm.
typically mobile apps and websites. When people are in the industry more and looking to push themselves further, that's when I start to bring in this idea of thinking about how users make decisions. Instead of thinking about user needs or about features, think about decision making, because that helps you break free from the way things are done now, and instead get to that bare bones of what information does somebody need? What are they trying to accomplish with that information? And then how do we move to the next decision that they need to make? What action are they going to take based off the decision they're making, and move on to that next decision? So that really
Hmm.
abstracts from what is and allows you to get to the spirit of what's needed. And it's going to match the way people think, which is great, because if you ask people to change or adapt to a new way of thinking, the adoption rates are going to, because it's you have to wrap your brain around something new, which is hard. So if you can fit something new into the way people think, they're going to adopt it way more likely. It's going to be much easier for them.
And are you working with the design students mostly, product students? What kind of students are you mostly working with?
So for the student work that I've done, it's been mostly students in design and UX or product design. For professionals that we work with, it's people that are in product management or engineers or things like that. So people that are not maybe designers, but they want to understand that area more, so that way they can feel like they can contribute more and provide better direction, and just be part of the process, because the process is fun. And I think people want to dip a toe in a way, maybe not be responsible for making the whole thing, but be able to feel more ownership of that final outcome.
Hmm. All right. As we, approach the end of the podcast, speaking, let's just go into foresight mode. Someone has been deeply, very deeply embedded in both design, product development. What emerging trends do you see shaping the future, or at least the ones that you're most excited about of these
Um,
fields?
yeah, so I think that the industry is at an interesting time because we have a couple trends happening right now, with the way that product design is approached within these large organizations. So, what's happening is the product design role itself is being more democratized. So, more people are responsible for the pieces, and it's being split up more. So, everybody has a design system. These big companies, they all have a design system.
Yeah.
So, then the role of a designer is actually split into two pieces. There's somebody figuring out the logic of what needs to be accomplished, and then there's somebody figuring out or adding to the design system. Now, the problem that this is creating is that now we're relying on multiple individuals to string together something that's going to work for a unified product vision. So this is putting more pressure on the product owner or product manager to be able to create that vision and make sure that it's accomplished through all of these different channels. Um, and right now, a lot of work that's being done is iterative. It's small jumps forward, and then a lot of reliance on best practices in that design system to be able to create something that's usable. Problem is that new technology that's coming out right now is really shaking things up. The use of like generative AI, for example, creates entirely new interaction paradigms. So now these structures that are divided are having to deal with the fact that there isn't a direct match. They don't have something in their component library. There isn't best practices set up yet. So as a product manager, you now have to figure out how to create something together. And for product managers that don't have a lot of design experience, this can be a major challenge. So I think what we're starting to see, and what I think we're going to continue to see, are products where they're kind of force fitting design systems to whatever the new technology is, and it's not leveraging the new technology to its fullest capabilities. So what we really need, and part of why we are trying to like teach these things, is giving more people the capability to think about these larger structures, and redefine what stuff can be beyond best practices and design systems. So that's the problem bubble I'm seeing build, and how I think design can play a pivotal role, or these design skills can play a pivotal role of breaking past that, and making truly differentiated products because of it.
I guess lots of the companies you end up working with, just to wrap this up, are and the stakeholders that you end up interacting with are not necessarily their design teams, or more people that are facing the direct sorry problem. But yeah, I understand, has a design firm, when you come to a company, you will have to interact with their what with your design peers inside those, at least the ones that are big enough to have big design structures and
Mhm.
so on. So that's also part of the process, right? Is when you're called in, you have a very specialized task force that you have to get into board to solve very specific problems on very mission critical aspects of the company. Right. Yeah, that was something that was not obvious for me when I was first
Yeah,
preparing this
it's a little
conversation.
different because yeah, we work with the product owner probably first. That's like our main point
Hmm.
of contact, and then from there, we're working with marketing, we're working with the design team, we're working with the engineers to kind of bring everyone together with a unified vision. That's a little different than what they've been doing previously because that's why they called us, right?
And
Need help.
one of the things that you were also telling me at the beginning is that you also started to, give workshops and training programs to some of part of their teams, right?
Yeah.
Because you want to ingrain this culture inside a company for other products, other projects.
Exactly. And even when we're just working on a project with somebody, so they didn't hire us for a full workshop where we really teach them the whole process, but just even when we work on a project together, um, we're we're talking them through why we're doing things and how we're doing them, so that way they can kind of get the spirit too and bring that further into their organization. So that way it's they're able to do this stuff on their own a little bit more, and able to be avoiding some of the messes that people can be in to where they decide, oh shoot, I really need external help because it is not where it needs to be right now, or we can't crack this nut, which is oftentimes when we get brought in. So
Mhm.
for the places that have internal teams already, anyways, there's places that don't have internal teams, and then they're reliant on places like us to give them
Yeah, I mean, you also have a portfolio with startups and companies that
exactly,
are obviously not building huge design structures,
exactly,
at least not in the beginning. Okay, and some of those products have become very successful. So,
absolutely.
Ashley, before we wrap up, let's do a fast this or that game.
Okay,
Um, and knowing that it's 6 a.m. or maybe 7 a.m. now, your time. First question: morning meetings or evening calls?
absolutely morning meetings. Get it done early.
Digital tools or traditional methods?
I think there's a place for both, but I gotta go digital tools here because they just make life so much easier. Can't beat that convenience.
Working remotely or in the office?
So we work hybrid at my company, and I absolutely love it. So I'm gonna cheat here and say both hybrid.
Okay, how much hybrid are you into?
um,
UA.
We do 3 days in the office and 2 days at home. So it's kind of the best of both worlds because you have that collaborative time together, but then it's the end of the week is when we're at home. And that's like the time to be like, okay, crunch time. I didn't get everything done this week. I could just like focus and plow through it all. So that's the way it works for us. And I think it's a great balance. But of course,
Do you have a long commute time or you're close to the office?
I'm 11 minutes from the office.
Oh, wow. Data driven decisions or intuition based choices?
So I have to go data here because an intuition based choice, that is a great hypothesis that we should test. And then from there, we have the data to either say that's good or bad. So I think you got to have the data in there because otherwise, there's just more risk.
Okay. And books or podcasts for learning?
I have to admit, I do podcasts much more than I do books. It's a nice thing, especially,
Yeah.
you know, go at my 11
Okay.
minute commute or
Thanks for being honest, because lots of people answer books for some reason. Like, yeah, I'm not really picking up old books, but podcasts tend to work so well, especially if you get to listen on commute or something
exactly.
while jogging. So, um, yeah, just a final recommendation, if you want. I mean, we'll probably put those into the show notes, but is there any books or podcasts that you would recommend for and again, like you said, there's not much when you're always kind of starting afresh, and starting afresh is always hard, but what do you resort to? What kind of literature or books or podcasts really are you listening to inspire yourself?
Yeah, so I've got a couple
And
different.
it can obviously be product related, design related, or not, right?
Yeah. I've got a couple different book recommendations, and they're really for different types of people. So when students are starting out and they're looking for advice on what books
Mm-hmm.
they read to help them dive into the UX industry and like be better prepared. So in that case, I always recommend this book called UX Magic. Um,
Wow.
it is a book that was written by a professor at San Jose State. And we really love their program. It happens to teach people how to deal with the data structures and like the organization, information architecture type of elements of design instead of just the component design and the visual aspect, which I think is where a lot of programs focus. So I always recommend that book for people who are trying to start out.
Yeah, I think that's the one by Daniel Rosenberg.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Um, for people that,
The second one?
yeah. So if you're already in the industry and maybe you had the type of start that I had, so I had a design start, and then it came time for me to do more vision related things, and I was making stuff up as I went, trying stuff out, but could use a little guidance. And in that case, I attended this workshop that was called the Influential Product Manager. And I found that workshop really helpful. And he has a book associated to that, which is, what he taught at the workshop. And that was really great because it helps just figure out how to make those general structures that can be used as guiding light principles and how to structure a project that's a longer term, bigger project to really challenge those assumptions. So I found his book to be really helpful when I was starting out in product management. So kind of
that's the Ken Sande book.
Exactly.
Yes, he was a speaker at Productized in 2020.
Oh, awesome.
So there's always a talk at our Productized podcast. Yes, and he was also a Productized podcast. So I guess just a few years before you. But yes, the Ken Sande is also a super lovely person and super nice as well. So thanks for the plug here. It was definitely not something we have agreed before the show. Ashley, thank you so much. I mean, it was super interesting and I felt I learned so much myself. Definitely don't worry, I'm not planning to do brain surgery anytime soon, so I'll stay away from it, but yes, it's definitely super insightful conversation because it mixes design, products, and so many aspects, and we could be here talking for many hours if we would delve in other industries that you have also worked with. But the good news is that you'll be with us very, very soon. That's like 1 month's time from now, and I'm super excited to meet you in person as well.
Yeah, it's gonna be great. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk through these types of things. Yeah, we could talk for hours, but I don't think anyone would tune in for that long. So hopefully this gave some gems. And, of course, the workshop is going to dive into this in a lot more detail, and then you can try stuff out yourself. So hopefully people can come. And if not, I'm sure there'll be other opportunities to be able to dig into this kind of content. This is something that we're really
guys, do come. Do join us in Lisbon because it's Ashley is not coming to Europe that often.
Yeah.